When you think of big Sega console franchises, what are some of the titles that you think of? Shinobi, Streets of Rage, Sonic? A lot of S's in there. Maybe Phantasy Star or Golden Axe. Or what about the original Sega mascot, Alex Kidd? And just to be clear, that's Alex Kidd, not Alex the Kid. Some people out there tend to get a little annoyed when you get that one wrong. But then there's another series out there that predates all of these and sometimes falls through the cracks a bit. Or at least it did before a recent resurgence starting in 2016 with a combination of remakes and completely new games on modern consoles. And that would be the Wonder Boy series, which pre-1995 had main series releases in the arcades, on the Master System, and on the Genesis and/or Mega Drive, not to mention numerous ports to non-Sega consoles and home computers. With as many releases as the series had during that time period, you might wonder why some of these games and the series itself isn't more well known. Well, I think there's two reasons for that, with the first being that, at least in the United States, the first Wonder Boy game is actually more well known as Hudson's Adventure Island on the NES. I personally ran afoul of that myself and had no idea that Wonder Boy was actually the original version of that game before reviewing it back in episode 51. The other reason that it's perhaps not more well known is its super confusing release history on consoles, with games not appearing in every region, titles appearing on both the Genesis and the Master System, and sequels with the same number but different names. And don't even get me started on Wonder Boy and Monster World's Japanese title, Wonder Boy 5 Monster World 3, which is not a sports score, but apparently a game that's a sequel to two series at the same time. However, I should probably pause for a second because I'm sure that there's some of you out there that don't know me and are confused because I specifically said in the last video that I was reviewing a 16-bit game this week. Well, believe me, I'm confused too, just in general. Hi, my name is Dave and welcome to Zilog and Moto, the channel where even after 250 episodes, I still make mistakes in putting the schedule together. Anyway, I'm out to collect and review the nearly 1,280 titles released in the English language for the Sega Master System, Genesis/Mega Drive, Sega or Mega CD as the case may be, and finally the 32X. Basically, if I can plug it into a Genesis either by itself or with some sort of add-on, and be able to read what's up on the screen, I'm trying to get a copy of it and review it for posterity, with both looks at that original packaging and gameplay captured from original hardware whenever possible. The game that I'm actually going to review today is Wonder Boy 3 The Dragon's Trap for the Master System. Now technically, if I was going in chronological order like I normally try to, I would actually be reviewing Wonder Boy 3 Monster Lair. And no, despite the 3 in both of those titles, they are not the same game. You see, I knew the next game in the series was supposed to be a 16-bit title, but I thought it was Wonder Boy Monster World because I forgot Wonder Boy 3 Monster Lair existed, due to that game not being released in the United States. And it might have slipped my mind that I don't have a copy of it yet. Well, now that I've finally settled on which Wonder Boy game I'm reviewing today, of course there's questions to answer with, is it any good? And will I retain my sanity throughout the review, being chief among them? Well, my sanity is a lost cause at this point, but this might still be a good game, so we'll take a look, but first, a look at the package. And this is my copy of Wonder Boy 3 The Dragon's Trap. You won't be able to tell at first, but this is one of the titles in my Master System library where, even though it got a release in the United States, I'm technically cheating by having a European copy in my collection instead. As far as the condition goes, it's in pretty good shape. There's a few marks on the outer cover, but everything else is intact for the most part, including the hang tab at the top, and the inner cover art is in perfect shape. I picked up the European version a few years ago because back then there was a larger difference in what it was selling for versus the North American version, but now if you want a copy and you're in the United States, you'll probably just end up spending whatever you'd save on international shipping. So either way, plan on spending between $50 and $60 if you want a copy for yourself. Now, does it really matter which version you have? I mean, the back of the package is technically a little different, and the manual is in a different format, so there is technically a difference, but from where I'm standing, the cover art is the same, and the actual information in the manual is
pretty close. If you're someone who's a stickler for specifically having the North American version because it's what you're trying to collect, then I get it, but I'm okay with just having this copy for now. First thing to note on the front cover is up in the corner where it advertises that the game supports password saves. And while that might not seem like a big deal at first, keep in mind that this game was released in fall of 1989. Being able to continue where you left off, whether it was with a password or battery backup, was not a given at the time, so it makes sense that Sega would want to advertise that. As far as the front cover art goes, this isn't bad. It's definitely a more cartoonish take on Wonder Boy from the previous game, and I'm good with that as I think it matches up better with what the game actually looks like. Technically, this version of the game was not released in Japan because by late 1989, Sega had stopped supporting that console in the region in favor of the Mega Drive, but there's still a Japanese cover to compare it to due to it getting a Game Gear release. Of the two, I definitely prefer that Japanese cover, but note that rather than it being Wonder Boy 3, it's instead named Monster World 2, because Japan just had to make everything more confusing. Flipping over the back, and here's where you can see why you might want the North American version. We've got 8 languages back here, so get out your magnifying glasses if you want to read this, but I'll save you the trouble. It's just a very quick summary setting up of how Wonder Boy got into his current predicament, which is going to require him to find something called the Salamander Cross. When you take into consideration that this was 1989, the screenshots are decent, and I like how they showed off 4 different areas in the game. Opening up the package, and the manual has a little bit of wear, but that's okay, as I'm sure this is the kind of game where you're probably going to be referring back to the manual a good bit. And having said that, there's lots of information in here, so you're going to want to spend some time reading the manual, which thankfully not only has a lot of text to explain things, but there's also tons of screenshots and original art to not just break things up, but to also better explain the game visually. While I'm sure in 2024 you could get by with just using the internet, this is one of those games where you're really going to want the manual if you can have it. Okay, that's the package. Let's play some Wonder Boy. Or is it Monster World? Potato, potato. If you're not familiar with the Wonder Boy games, the series started out in the arcades, and the first 3 games in that series, Wonder Boy in Monsterland, and Wonder Boy 3 Monster Lair, all started out as arcade machines, before being ported to various consoles and home computers. And yes, as I mentioned in the intro, Wonder Boy 3 Monster Lair, not Wonder Boy 3 The Dragon's Trap, is technically considered the 3rd game in the series, at least chronologically speaking. I'll make sure I write that wrong and review Monster Lair the next time the series comes up on the channel. But even though The Dragon's Trap is not technically the 3rd game in the series, it is a direct sequel from Wonder Boy in Monsterland, hence why Sega and West One Entertainment decided to put a 3 in its name. And of course, it being the 3rd game to appear on the Master System helped that tortured bit of logic out as well. If you're Japanese, that direct correlation is called out a little more clearly with Wonder Boy in Monsterland instead going by the name Super Wonder Boy Monster World, and then Dragon's Trap being named Monster World 2 when it was originally released on the Game Gear in 1992. Although, and I fear I'm falling into a bit of a hole here, Monster World 2 technically wasn't released by that name until after its sequel, Wonder Boy 5 Monster World 3, came out for the Mega Drive, which makes me wonder how that even came about. Well, to answer that question, apparently if you play Dragon's Trap in a Japanese Master System, there's coding to show a different title screen with the Monster World 2 label. So clearly the game was originally planned for release in Japan, and just canceled at some point when Sega discontinued support for the Master System in that region. Regardless of the confusing naming on the various releases, West One tied the Dragon's Trap directly to Monsterland in one of the best and most logical ways possible, with the beginning of Dragon's Trap effectively being the end of Monsterland. Monster World? Whatever. The first scene of Dragon's Trap has Wonder Boy entering Mecha Dragons, aka the final boss from Monsterland, lair, with Wonder Boy having a full set of upgrades to make the fight fair. Once you defeat Mecha Dragon, it's time to make your way out, but there's just one problem. Defeating Mecha Dragon comes with a price, as you're now cursed by being turned into a lizard yourself. And now you understand why the game is called the Dragon's Trap. Worse yet, as you escape Mecha Dragon's collapsing castle in new Lizard Man form, you manage to lose all of your endgame inventory, meaning that now the Dragon's Trap will start in earnest, with you having to work your way back up to full strength and general badassery. With Monsterland originating in the arcades, West One Entertainment wanted to try something different from the first game, which was just a pure action platformer, and make things more interesting by adding some RPG elements to the game. Of course, even with those elements, the game still had a specific level structure with a beginning and an end, because making the game a full action RPG, similar to, say, The Legend of Zelda, wouldn't really work in the arcades, where the goal was to have the arcade machines make as much money as possible. The Dragon's Trap, originating on the Master System, was freed from those arcade bonds, and as such leans directly into the action RPG genre, but still sticks to its side-scrolling platform roots, rather than adopt a top-down or three-quarters view. The best comparison I can make, especially if you're familiar with this channel, is that the Dragon's Trap is very similar to Lord of the Sword, just if Lord of the Sword didn't suck. Or more directly, it's similar to what was set up in Monsterland, but configured as an open-world adventure, and dare I say, is an early example of a Metroidvania. With that style of game, the gimmick is that the game is open world until it's not. What I mean by that is that you can go wherever you want as soon as you escape Mecha Dragon's castle, but there's only certain places that you can go, with others being locked until you progress to certain points in the game. In a game like Metroid, this is usually done by needing to collect certain items or weapon power-ups, and there's some of that here as well, with 2 specific swords that are needed to get to certain areas. But the Dragon's Trap put its unique spin on things by also having the character have different animal forms, each with their own unique abilities, with the different forms being gained by defeating specific boss dragons in the game. I've already mentioned Lizard Man, who doesn't really have anything special about him other than not being human, but then there's also Mouse Man, who can cling to certain walls and get through smaller areas, Piranha Man, who can swim to areas that other forms can't, Lion Man, whose attack pattern is larger than any other creature and as a result can reach things that other forms can't, and finally Hawkman, who of course can fly, allowing him to fly to areas that are otherwise inaccessible. Adding another wrinkle to the ability to take different forms comes from the items that you can collect and equip. As you go through the game, you can collect different swords, shields, and sets of armor, and as a rule, the more expensive, the better they are, pretty standard for RPGs. However, some animal forms are able to utilize the different items better than others, adding another layer to the different forms and making it to where you actually have to think a bit besides just always equipping the latest and greatest and going with it. If you couldn't tell, while at first I wasn't sure about the whole different forms thing, especially since early on in the game you're locked to which form you can use until you find a transforming room, I really enjoyed how well thought out and designed the structure of the game is. The way that the game would just slowly open up naturally, one ability at a time, is pretty impressive, especially for 1989. While it certainly wasn't the first action RPG to do this, my son actually asked me what came first, this or Castlevania, while I was playing it, how effortlessly it pulled it off, with a very even difficulty as you progress, is something that a lot of other games can't claim. I think my only complaint there is, and I could be mistaken, but early on I missed the 3rd heart upgrade, and even though I found where the 4th heart upgrade was supposed to be, the game wouldn't give it to me without finding the previous one, which seems like a mistake. As far as the gameplay is concerned, it's relatively simple with just a button to attack and a button to jump, but then you also have 5 special weapons that you can collect, and then those can be triggered by holding down and jump. The special weapons, just like the equipment that you're using, is selected by going into the status menu, which normally would require players to hit the pause button located on their Master System. In the old days, when players often were sitting right in front of the TV, with the Master System being close by, having to use the pause button located on the console wasn't that big a deal. But even then, it was still at least inconvenient, and highlighted the one way in which the NES was superior to the Master System, having that start select button directly on the controller. Nowadays, this is an even bigger issue, with players, i.e. me, using wireless controllers and big screen TVs that are often on the other side of the room. However, some designer, in a stroke of genius, came up with a way around this by allowing the player to hook up a controller into port 2 and then use the D-pad on it to bring up the status menu instead. As silly as it might seem, this was a game changer for me because unlike something like Lord of the Sword where you need to use the pause button to get a questionably useful map, you will need to go into the status menu pretty frequently when playing the Dragon's Trap, whether it's for these special weapons or to look at your equipment. And being able to use that second controller instead makes it almost as if you had that missing start or select button on your controller. The graphics in the Dragon's Trap are clearly reminiscent of Monsterland, and make things seem even more obvious that this is a direct sequel. The game is very colorful, showing off one of the Master System's main advantages over the NES. And while the backgrounds in places can seem a little plain, that's made up for by the number of them, and with the game having numerous unique-looking areas to keep things varied. Along with that, there's plenty of well-drawn enemy types, so that you won't get bored of just killing the same few annoyances, and they used palette swapping not as a crutch, but as a useful indicator for the player to know that things were about to get tougher. With as good as the graphics and the sound are, more on that in just a sec, the fact that they were able to keep things in the same size 2 megabit cartridge used as in Monsterland for what's clearly a larger game is very impressive. From a music perspective, the Dragon's Trap has a solid soundtrack with plenty of variety, as there are quite a different background tracks that will play during gameplay, depending on what area of the map you're in, or perhaps if you're in the middle of a boss fight. The composition is fantastic and sounds pretty advanced for the Master System, certainly far more complex than the average soundtrack on a console, with even some variations in the synths that are used. The sound effects are decent as well, but I definitely think that more work was put towards the soundtrack. But wait, there's more. The Dragon's Trap, even though it wasn't released in Japan, was one of the Master System games that featured an FM soundtrack for use with the FM sound unit. And I must say that for the first time on the channel, the FM version blows away the PSG version. In the past, if the FM version had better sounding music, for whatever reason these sound effects would be noticeably worse, making things a bit of a wash. But in the Dragon's Trap, the music and the sound effects are both substantially improved. If you have the opportunity to play with the FM version, I strongly recommend doing so, but either way, the audio doesn't disappoint. I think I may have had the most fun playing the Dragon's Trap this week out of any of the Wonder Boy games so far on the channel. And that's saying something because while I thought Monsterland was a little bit flawed, especially towards the end, I really like the original Wonder Boy, as not only is it a solid platformer, but it was nice to play the true version of the game and not Hudson's Adventure Island. The Dragon's Trap builds on that though, and is now not just a solid platformer, but a nice action RPG as well, that is significantly advanced for being a game that was still technically released in the 80s. Due to that, and in a first for the series so far, I'm giving Wonder Boy 3 The Dragon's Trap 4 stars. This is a game that I definitely think should be in everyone's Master System library, and with it being reasonably priced these days, it's hard to argue against picking it up.
And that's it for Wonder Boy 3 The Dragon's Trap. This is the type of game that makes weeks like last week, where I reviewed Power Factory for the Sega CD, completely worth it, because reviewing something terrible like that really makes you appreciate when a developer does almost everything right, like they did with The Dragon's Trap. I'm pretty sure that I've mentioned this old axiom before, but Beavis and Butthead were never more right when Butthead said, "You need to have stuff that sucks to have stuff that's cool." Wise words, Butthead. Next time on Zilog and Moto, it's time to break one of the rules of the channel and fire up the old emulator because it's time for some light gun action. Hopefully I can remember to get all that to work like last time because It's been a little while since I've had to review a light gun game, as honestly, there's really not that many of them in these libraries. Specifically, the next game up is yet another one that I've never played before, but I am pretty familiar with it as it was well advertised in magazines back in the day. It's a sequel to a game that I've already looked at twice on the channel, and I'm very curious to see how the developers handled a radically different setting this time around, as Dirty Harry is out and the man with no name is in. Well, that's it for Zilog and Moto episode 251. If you liked what you saw here and want to see more, please think about liking and subscribing if you're so inclined, as it will help more people see these videos. But most importantly, whatever you like to play, have fun and be excellent to each other. Later.